When you walk with God, your life begins to flourish. There is a kind of life that looks full on the outside yet feels dry on the inside. And there is another kind of life that may still face challenges but feels deeply rooted, alive, and steady. The difference between the two is not effort, discipline, or even activity for God. It is presence. Walking in God's presence is not about perfection or performance. It is about nearness. And when a life is shaped by nearness to God, it begins to flourish in ways that cannot be manufactured. Many believers spend years trying to grow without first learning how to abide. They chase improvement, breakthroughs, and change, yet overlook the simple, powerful reality the Bible teaches again and again. Flourishing flows from presence. When God is near, life changes, not always instantly, but inevitably. Growth begins to happen quietly. Strength replaces striving. Peace settles where anxiety once ruled. And even in seasons that are hard, something within you remains alive. Walking in God's presence does not mean you no longer struggle. It means you are no longer walking alone. It means you begin to notice God in ordinary moments, in decisions, conversations, pauses, and prayers that don't feel dramatic but are deeply real. His presence becomes less of a place you visit and more of a relationship you live from. The Bible consistently connects God's presence with life, fruitfulness, and renewal. Where God is near, hearts are restored. Where He walks with His people, growth follows. This is not about emotional experiences or spiritual hype. It is about alignment. When your life begins to move in step with God, flourishing becomes a byproduct. Not something you chase, but something that grows naturally. If you felt weary in your faith, dry in your spirit, or unsure whether you're truly walking closely with God, this message is meant to bring clarity and reassurance. God's presence leaves evidence. It reshapes the inner life first, then slowly transforms everything else. You may already be walking in His presence more than you realize. And if that's true, there are signs, quiet, steady, unmistakable signs, that your life is beginning to flourish, not because circumstances are perfect, but because God is near. Number 1, your inner life is becoming steadier than your circumstances. One of the clearest signs that you are walking in God's presence is not what is happening around you, but what is happening within you. Circumstances may still shift. Challenges may still arise. Uncertainty may still exist. Yet somewhere deep inside, something has changed. Your inner life is no longer tossed around as easily as it once was. There is a steadiness that cannot be explained by logic alone. This stability is not emotional numbness. You still feel deeply. You still care. But anxiety no longer controls the narrative of your thoughts. Fear no longer has the final word. When pressure comes, you may feel it, but it doesn't define you. That kind of inner grounding is not self-produced. It is the fruit of God's presence. The Bible shows us that when God walks closely with His people, He becomes their anchor. Peace does not replace problems, but it guards the heart within them. This is why flourishing always begins internally. Before life looks different on the outside, the soul becomes rooted on the inside. You may notice that you recover faster after disappointment. You process pain more honestly without being overwhelmed by it. You're able to wait without unraveling. You can face unknowns without constant panic. These are not small changes. They are signs that God's presence is shaping your inner world. Walking in God's presence teaches your soul where to rest. It reminds you that your security is not tied to outcomes, timelines, or approval. God becomes your reference point. And when God is the reference point, circumstances lose their power to destabilize you. If you sense this inner steadiness growing, even slowly, don't dismiss it. This is what flourishing looks like at its root. God always strengthens the inner life before He transforms the outer one. A steady soul is evidence of a present God. Number 2, your desires are slowly aligning with God's heart. Another powerful sign that you are walking in God's presence is a quiet but noticeable shift in what you want. Desires don't disappear overnight, but they begin to reorder themselves. Things that once consumed your energy start losing their grip. Things that once felt optional begin to matter more, not because you forced yourself to change, but because closeness to God reshapes the heart. Walking in God's presence exposes desires to truth. You begin to recognize which longings are rooted in fear, comparison, or insecurity, and which are rooted in purpose and love. Over time, your motivations soften. You care less about proving yourself and more about pleasing God, less about chasing fulfillment and more about walking faithfully. This alignment doesn't make you passive or unambitious. It makes you purposeful. Your goals begin to reflect God's values. You start asking different questions. Not just what do I want, but what is God forming in me? Not just what will benefit me, but what honors God and serves others. Scripture teaches that when we walk closely with God, He shapes our desires from the inside out. Flourishing is not about getting everything you want. It's about wanting what leads to life. And when your desires begin to mirror God's heart, peace follows because there is less internal conflict. You may notice that obedience feels less forced. Surrender feels less threatening. Trust feels more natural. This is not because you have become stronger. It's because God's presence has become more real. His nearness clarifies what truly matters. If you sense this shift, this gradual alignment of desire, recognize it as growth. It is one of the clearest signs that your life is being shaped by God's presence. When desires align, the soul flourishes, and flourishing always flows from walking closely with the one who knows your heart best. Number 3, growth is happening, even in difficult seasons. One of the most surprising signs that you are walking in God's presence is that growth continues even when life feels hard. Not the kind of growth that feels exciting or visible, but the kind that reshapes you quietly from the inside. You may still be facing obstacles. Prayers may still feel unanswered. Circumstances may still stretch your faith. Yet instead of shrinking, something in you is maturing. This kind of growth cannot be produced by comfort. It comes from proximity to God. When you walk in His presence, hardship does not become meaningless. It becomes formative. Pain no longer feels wasted. Waiting no longer feels empty. God uses pressure not to break you, but to deepen you. You begin to notice that trials no longer harden your heart the way they once did. Instead of becoming bitter, you become more reflective. Instead of pulling away from God, you lean in. You learn how to grieve honestly without losing hope. You discover resilience you didn't know you had. Not because you are strong, but because God is near. The Bible repeatedly shows us that flourishing is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of God within it. Trees planted by water still face heat, but they do not wither. In the same way, when you walk in God's presence, your life remains rooted even when seasons are dry. If you look back and realize that challenges have produced wisdom rather than despair, compassion rather than cynicism, patience rather than panic, that is not accidental. That is growth, happening under God's care. His presence turns hardship into soil rather than a dead end. Flourishing does not always look like outward success. Sometimes it looks like endurance with hope intact. Sometimes it looks like faith that remains steady when answers are delayed. And if that kind of growth is happening in you, it is a strong sign that you are walking closely with God right where you are. Number 4, your relationships begin reflecting grace and wisdom. Another sign that you are walking in God's presence is the way your relationships begin to change. Not because other people suddenly become easier, but because you do. God's presence reshapes how you listen, how you respond, and how you love. Over time, grace begins to replace reactivity, and wisdom replaces impulse. You may notice that you're slower to judge and quicker to understand. You don't feel the same need to win every argument or defend every opinion. You become more patient with weakness, both in others and in yourself. This doesn't mean you tolerate harm or avoid truth. It means you handle truth with humility and care. Walking in God's presence softens the heart without weakening it. You learn when to speak and when to remain silent, when to set boundaries and when to extend mercy. Relationships stop being driven by fear of rejection or desire for control, and start being shaped by love and discernment. The Bible teaches that God's presence produces fruit, and much of that fruit shows up in how we treat people. Kindness becomes more natural. Forgiveness becomes possible, where it once felt impossible. You begin to value peace without avoiding honesty. And even when conflict arises, it doesn't consume you the way it once did. If people feel safer around you than before, more seen, more heard, more respected, that is evidence of God's presence working through you. Flourishing is never just personal. It overflows relationally. A life rooted in God's presence carries His character into every connection. This kind of relational change doesn't happen overnight. But if you've noticed healthier patterns emerging, deeper empathy forming, or wisdom guiding your interactions, don't overlook it. These are signs of a flourishing life, one shaped not by self-effort but by walking daily in the presence of a gracious God. Number 5. You are becoming more sensitive to God's leading. As you continue walking in God's presence, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. You become more aware of why His leading, not in dramatic flashes or constant signs, but in quiet clarity. Decisions that once felt confusing now come with a sense of direction. You don't always know the full outcome, but you sense when a step is right, when it's time to wait, or when something no longer aligns with God's heart. This sensitivity doesn't make life effortless. It makes it intentional. You begin to notice God's guidance through peace rather than pressure, through conviction rather than panic. You learn to recognize the difference between fear pushing you forward and faith inviting you to trust. That discernment grows as you stay close to God. Walking in God's presence sharpens your spiritual awareness. You become quicker to notice when something unsettles your spirit, even if it looks appealing on the surface. You also recognize when peace settles in, even if the decision requires courage. This inner witness becomes a reliable guide, not because you're perfect, but because you're attentive. Scripture teaches that God leads His people like a shepherd, gently, patiently, personally. When you walk closely with Him, His voice becomes familiar. You don't need constant reassurance because you're learning His tone. Over time, guidance feels less mysterious and more relational. If you've noticed that you're less reactive and more prayerful before decisions, that is growth. If you find yourself pausing to ask God rather than rushing ahead, that is evidence of His presence shaping you. Flourishing does not mean moving faster. It means moving wisely. God's leading rarely removes uncertainty entirely, but it replaces confusion with trust. And if you're experiencing that growing sensitivity, it's a sign you are walking closely with Him. Where God's presence is honored, guidance becomes clearer, not because the path is easy, but because the shepherd is near. Number 6, you feel strengthened rather than drained by faith. Another unmistakable sign that you are walking in God's presence is the way faith begins to give you strength instead of exhausting you. There was a time when faith may have felt heavy, like something you had to maintain, prove, or constantly measure. But now something has shifted. Being with God feels like rest, not strain. This doesn't mean life is easy or responsibilities disappear. It means your source has changed. Instead of relying on your own effort to sustain faith, you are learning to draw strength from God's nearness. Prayer no longer feels like an obligation you must fulfill. Worship no longer feels like something you perform. Faith becomes a place you return to for renewal. Walking in God's presence replaces striving with abiding. You stop trying to force growth and start trusting God to produce it. You discover that spiritual life was never meant to drain you. It was meant to sustain you. And when you remain close to God, His presence refreshes you in ways nothing else can. Scripture shows us that those who dwell in God's presence are renewed, not depleted. Strength is exchanged. Weariness finds relief. Hope is restored. This doesn't happen because you avoid hardship, but because you carry God's presence into it. If you've noticed that your faith now brings peace instead of pressure, clarity instead of confusion, that is a sign of flourishing. Even when you're tired, you're not empty. Even when you give, you're not depleted. God's presence replenishes what obedience requires. This strength is quiet, but enduring. It allows you to keep showing up, keep trusting, keep loving, without burning out. And if your faith feels more life-giving than it used to, recognize it for what it is. Evidence that you are walking in the presence of a God who restores, sustains, and strengthens His people. Number 7. Your life bears fruit that quietly points others to God. One of the most beautiful signs that you are walking in God's presence is that your life begins to bear fruit. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that speaks for itself. People may not be able to name exactly what has changed about you, but they sense it. There is a steadiness, a gentleness, a depth that wasn't there before. And that quiet transformation points beyond you. This fruit doesn't come from trying harder. It comes from staying close. When you walk in God's presence, His character slowly becomes visible in your life. Love becomes more consistent. Patience grows where irritation once lived. Faithfulness shows up in small, unseen ways. Peace accompanies you into places that used to unsettle you. What's striking about this fruit is that it often appears without announcement. You don't feel the need to prove your faith or explain yourself constantly. Your responses change. Your priorities shift. Your presence carries something different, and others notice not because you are louder, but because you are rooted. The Bible teaches that a life connected to God will naturally produce fruit in season. This fruit doesn't draw attention to the branch. It points to the source. When people are encouraged by your words, steadied by your calm, or comforted by your compassion, God is being made visible through you. You may not see the full impact of this fruit. Often the most meaningful influence happens quietly. A conversation that brought hope, a decision that modeled integrity, a response that reflected grace instead of reaction. These moments matter deeply, even if they go uncelebrated. If your life is producing fruit that blesses others even in small ways, recognize it as a sign of flourishing. God's presence is not meant to terminate in you. It is meant to flow through you. And when it does, your life becomes a living testimony, not of your strength, but of God's nearness. This kind of fruit lasts. It endures seasons, and it continues growing as long as you remain close to the one who produces it. Conclusion. Flourishing begins where God's presence is honored. A flourishing life is not built on perfect circumstances, constant success, or uninterrupted joy. According to the Bible, it is built on presence. When you walk with God day by day, moment by moment, life begins to take on a different quality. Strength replaces striving. Peace steadies the soul. Growth continues even when seasons are hard. If you recognize these signs in your life, don't rush past them. They are not small. They are evidence that God is near, that your life is rooted, and that something healthy is growing beneath the surface. Flourishing does not always shout. Often it whispers through steady faith, quiet obedience, and deep trust. And if you don't recognize all these signs yet, don't be discouraged. Walking in God's presence is not about achieving a certain level. It is about staying close. God is patient. He meets you where you are, and every step taken with Him leads toward life. Take time to reflect on where God's presence has been shaping you. Notice the growth, that has already begun. Thank him for the ways he is sustaining you, and choose again and again to remain near, not because it guarantees ease, but because it guarantees life. If this message encouraged your heart, share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment, subscribe for more faith-filled messages, and stay connected. Because when you walk in God's presence, flourishing is not something you chase. It is something that grows naturally, rooted in nearness, sustained by grace and guided by a faithful God.